There are some places you can live around for years and years and still find ways to be surprised by them. Deep Creek Lake is definitely one of those places. I've spent years photographing it, writing about it, boating on it, walking on it when it's frozen. And then one day, someone invited me to go sailing. And suddenly I realized there's a whole side of the lake that I've never experienced. Welcome to The Backbone. I'm Sarah Myers, and today we're going sailing. When Cheryl and her husband Greg invited me to join her for an afternoon sail with the Deep Creek Lake Yacht Club at Turkey Neck, of course I said yes, because when someone gives you an opportunity like this to try something you've never done before, you obviously go. And that's been my philosophy lately. Although I probably should admit right up front, I had absolutely no idea what I was getting myself into. We pulled into Turkey Neck, and the weather wasn't exactly convincing me that sailing was a great idea. The sky looked heavy. I had that feeling where you look up and think, yeah, rain's probably coming. And if you had asked me at that moment, I would have said there's a pretty good chance that we were going to spend the afternoon sitting on the dock watching the rain instead of sailing across the lake. But Cheryl and Greg, they had a completely different opinion. The wind's perfect, they said. Apparently, I was going to have to just trust them. The boat we were sailing was a Flying Scot, and it was smaller than I expected. There were 4 of us aboard: Cheryl, Greg, and our podcasting extraordinaire, Tracy, and myself, which meant there wasn't exactly a lot of room to spread out. Everything had its place: the sails, the lines, the equipment, and apparently me, just trying really hard not to be in the way. Before we even untied from the dock, I realized I should probably pay attention, especially when Greg looked right at me and said, "Watch the boom." That was my first official sailing instruction: watch the boom, and I have to say, I remembered that one. Once we headed out onto the lake, Cheryl started explaining what everything was called and how everything operated. She was a flurry of attention to the wind, to the water, to the ropes, and to the side of the boat. There were a lot of things to learn. There were lines everywhere. All of them had a purpose. I learned about sheets, tacking, port, starboard, and telltales. Telltales are those little pieces of string attached to the sail that help you understand whether you're catching the wind the way that you intend. And I have to be honest, I didn't memorize all of this at once. I spent a good portion of the first part of the trip just trying to stay out of the way. But what surprised me the most was how active sailing actually is. From the shore, sailboats almost seem effortless, and the sails are a ballet across the water. They look peaceful. But once you're actually on the boat, it's a completely different experience. You're constantly moving. One minute you're on one side of the boat. The next one, you're on the other side of the boat. You're watching the sails, watching the wind, watching for other boaters, watching the telltales, listening for instructions, and of course, watching for the boom. There's a lot going on. And somehow everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing, but I was still figuring out where I was supposed to sit, trying to make myself small, not to interrupt. But then I started to settle into it and notice the little things like the water against the boat, the movement of the sails, the wind changing, the way Greg and Cheryl communicated with each other. It was a completely different way of experiencing Deep Creek Lake, and it was pretty awesome. Now, Cheryl, if you're listening to this, I have to confess something. There was one point when we were tacking that I got just a little nauseous. My face got flush, my stomach did a flip-flop, and I was planning my exit strategy, if you will. But thankfully, we started going the other direction, and I kept looking at the horizon and the feeling passed. Whew. Once it did, though, I could relax a little bit more and really pay attention to what was happening around me. One of the most fascinating parts of our afternoon sail was watching Cheryl. She just seemed to be able to read the wind by looking out at the water, and she would let us know when gusts were coming and when other boaters were in our path, and she's just really an excellent sailor. Greg stayed calm in the back, doing most of the steering. That's when I started thinking about how different sailing must feel when you've been doing it for years. What looked complicated to me was second nature to Greg and Cheryl. The movement, the communication, the timing, the understanding of the wind, it all came together, and we began to understand why people become so passionate about sailing. Near the end of the sail, Greg asked me a question I wasn't quite expecting. He asked if I wanted to steer. Sure, why not? What could possibly go wrong? Well, for the first minute or two at the helm, I definitely overcorrected. The steering was much more sensitive than I expected. The boat went one way, I corrected. The boat went the other way, I corrected. Somewhere in there, I'm pretty sure everyone else in the boat was politely just trying not to panic. I won't be entering any regattas anytime soon, but eventually I managed to keep us moving in roughly the right direction with just small movements on the till. And I'm going to call that a win. Everyone has to start somewhere. The biggest takeaway of the afternoon wasn't learning how to steer, and it wasn't learning the difference between port and starboard. And it definitely wasn't mastering the telltales, but it was realizing that there's an entire sailing community at Deep Creek Lake that I really knew nothing about. These club members are passionate about sailing, where they race, they teach, they share their knowledge, and they really welcome newcomers. This Turkey Neck Yacht Club is one of 2 yacht clubs at Deep Creek Lake, and each weekend they're sailing in regattas that have about 50 or 60 boats in them. Trying something new can be intimidating, especially when you're surrounded by people who clearly know what they're doing. But the people I met that afternoon were so enthusiastic about sharing their love for sailing, and that made the experience feel less like an outsider and more like I was getting a glimpse into the community that has been part of Deep Creek Lake for generations. If you'd like to learn more about sailing in the Deep Creek Lake Yacht Club at Turkey Neck, you can visit dclsa-tn.com. On the top of the website, there's a motto that really captures what this community is about. It says, "Where the love of sailing, deep-rooted family traditions, and everlasting friendships guide us to carry on the legacy found within this treasured Deep Creek Lake microcosm." And that idea of legacy is something we'll be exploring more. We'll be meeting up with our friends again and sharing another story about the history and legacy of the yacht club and also the manufacturing of the Flying Scot. So stay tuned for that. And we're excited to share more. So just remember, when you spend years around Deep Creek Lake, it's easy to think you've seen it all. You know the views, you know the roads, you know the shoreline, and you know where the people gather. But someone hands you a life jacket, tells you to watch the boom, and takes you sailing. And suddenly, you're seeing Deep Creek Lake from an entirely different perspective. That's probably my favorite part about what I do. There's always something new to discover, another story, another person, another community, and another corner of this life that I haven't experienced yet. I definitely do it again. Thank you for joining me on this edition of the Backbone Podcast, stories and perspectives from Western Maryland. Until next time, keep exploring and discovering. And wherever you are on Deep Creek Lake, watch the boom.